Thanks very much. Can people hear me okay? Can I just say two things in my defense if this all goes horribly wrong? One is that I've got a bad throat, and that is maybe a slight problem. More fundamentally, I've got rather more notes for my talk than I normally do. In fact, about 3 times as many. So if this all goes on into the next session, you'll know why. But I'm hoping that Kate will be able to control me and shut me up if I do go on for too long. The reason I think there's so many notes and there's so much to talk about is that this is an incredibly important question. It's also an incredibly complex question. And there's all sorts of ways you can look at the question of woke. I mean, I'm going to talk about it in terms of the whole question of sort of racism, women's rights, LGBT, those kind of questions. But of course, there's all sorts of issues that are brought up in other ways, you know, whether it's, you know, the ULEZ zone in London, which is stopping motorists from having their own freedoms, or whether it's about climate, or whether there's a whole range of different things which are designated as woke in a way that we perhaps haven't heard until recent years. And in fact, you know, there used to be other ways of talking about this. You know, people do and did and still do talk about culture wars. People also used to talk, although this seems to have gone out of fashion in reactionary circles, they used to talk about political correctness gone mad. In other words, that you were, you know, you were saying all sorts of things that really it wasn't reasonable to expect people to do. And I want to try and sort of make some what will be fairly preliminary points, and obviously we can have a discussion and see where people think we're going. We've also obviously got this against a background of the election of Trump, and we had the last session where we talked about Trump and imperialism, but the whole culture wars question, the way in which he's approaching these things is obviously an important one in terms of migration, in terms of trans issues, in terms of all those sorts of things. So, and we have in Britain, we have, of course, the rise of reform, which while is not in the same register as Trump and is obviously away from being as dominant in terms, yeah, there's 5 reform MPs, but the fact that in some polls they're first in the opinion polls ahead of Labour and the Tories does give you some kind of cause for worry. And of course, Trump, Farage this week alone referred to the Employment Rights Bill, which is a bill which is which may well still be watered down by Labour, but is an attempt to say that employees should have more rights at work. One of the things that it does is to include a clause which would allow staff in bars and restaurants and cafes not to be harassed or insulted by their customers or indeed their employers. And Farage has described this as a banter ban. In other words, it will stop people talking in bars about veganism and trans questions. Whether that is what people in bars talk about all the time, I've no idea, certainly not in my circle. But, you know, the idea that somehow this is the kind of way that everything is being policed, that you can't even come out with a decent old racist or sexist remark if you're standing at a saloon bar. And you know, that's a lot of the approach. And a lot of the approach is, of course, the way, and I think the way in which it gets sort of wider traction than the kind of really hardline racists and sexists is because it plays to this idea that everything's all gone too far. You know, that it was all right to have race relations laws, it was all right to have the Sex Discrimination Act, but hasn't it all gone too far and nobody can say anything, and men feel weakened and emasculated by all of this and all the different things that we get. Now, I think what's important to understand, when people raise that sentiment, it's not the overt racism of, say, Enoch Powell in 1968, when he talked about rivers of blood being caused by immigration. It's not the overt sexism of somebody like Andrew Tate, who talks very openly about, in totally degrading ways, about women. But it is a very, very insidious form of trying to roll back equalities, which we should all be in favour of. And it's also interesting to note that whereas you know, you could spot a racist as good old-fashioned racist some years ago, but now we have black Tories and Asian Tories and indeed black and Asian Labour people who are quite capable of making some of these sorts of remarks and of attacking other groups of the oppressed. And perhaps the most the most obvious example of the way in which supposedly egalitarian policies have been used against the left is, of course, the whole anti-Semitism slur against Jeremy Corbyn and against all of us, you know, that if in some way you support the Palestinians, you must be anti-Semitic, is a way that the right have used supposedly egalitarian ideas in order to attack the left. So this is a complicated question, and we've got to be, you know, I think all of us in this room, I hope, would say that we're in favour of equality for everybody, but we've also got to look at the way in which these ideas are used and the way in which they're being weaponized in many ways. Now, why is it happening now? I mean, I would suggest that the main reason it's happening is we've had nearly 20 years now of pretty much worsening of living standards in the developed world, you know, in Germany, in Britain, in the United States, and all these countries, worsening of living standards, an absolutely massive onslaught on workers' rights in terms of not just trade union laws, but the conditions under which people work. Speaking as somebody who, you know, until recently was sort of teaching in a university, the worsening of conditions in those in the last few years, actually post-COVID, is very, very shocking if you actually look at what is happening. And a general sort of social crisis that has arisen over recent years, you know, compared to, say, even 10 years ago when the Tory equivalent of Prime Minister in Germany was welcoming refugees into the country. Now Germany is putting up extra border posts to stop people coming into what should be an area of free movement. So you've got this acute social crisis which has also led into it. Now, the odd thing about this is that in lots of ways, social attitudes have changed for the better in this country and in many other countries over the last few decades. I mean, if you look, the British Social Attitude Survey last year or the year before, did a number of surveys of how people's attitudes have changed. So, for example, 81% thought it was okay for a couple to live together rather than getting married. That compared to 61% only 30 years ago in 1994. 67% thought same-sex relationships were never wrong, whereas only 17% of people thought that in 1983. So you see very, very big changes in all of these sorts of things, which I think all of us would say are for the better. And now you have same-sex marriages, civil partnerships, and so on. You have much more, not just here, but in countries which had an extremely repressive social background, for example, in Ireland, where you now have same-sex marriage and so on. And 45% of people disagree that people who want children should get married. 50% of people agree that one parent can bring up a child as well as two. Now, these are all, you know, compared to when I was growing up, are really kind of revolutionary changes. But there are areas, particularly in recent years, in the last 5 or 6 years, where things have gone backwards. For example, support for trans people has gone backwards compared to 2019. 82% of people describe themselves as not prejudiced against trans people. Now it's 64% describe themselves as not prejudiced. Now we can perhaps discuss why this is. I think it's for a whole number of quite complex reasons, including that I think people were much less aware of the issues in 2019 than they have been in recent years. And that means that some of the different issues, that there's a general acceptance of trans people, but when it comes to, for example, trans women in sport, much less support for that, and much less support for trans women in single-sex spaces. And those are things that I think are, whether we agree with them or not, that they are issues that are totally understandable, because people think it's fine to have the sort of general acceptance, but there may be issues where it's much more difficult. It's also been the case that in recent years, there's loads more talk about anti-woke. And in this slide here, there were just 10 newspaper articles about these kind of questions, which will include trans, obviously will include loads more things as well. By 2022, this number had risen to 882. So there's been a big change in the way that people are looking at these questions, discussing them, and doing all those kind of things. So it's true about trans. It's also true about immigration, where people have become less favourable towards immigration over the last 4 or 5 years. I don't think any of us will be surprised when you look at the onslaught by government and media over the boats coming in and all the other things that have happened. And of course, it's also true about Muslims, which partly overlaps with the whole question of immigration and of people coming on boats, very large numbers of whom are from Muslim majority countries. But also, again, if you look at the argument against Muslims, it's very often not done on the basis of race. It's like, oh, I don't have any problem with brown people or black people, but I don't like their religion, or their religion discriminates against women, or it's conservative and it's, you know, a thing that you can say about any religion, actually. But, you know, these kind of arguments are the ones that people put. So in those areas, I would argue that the kind of progressive era which opened up in the 1960s with to do with racism, to do with sexism, to do with homophobia, to do with all the different discriminations against oppressed people, that has begun not to be reversed, because I think particularly with women's rights, it's extremely hard for them to reverse women's rights because of women's much more central role in the workforce. But definitely there are these certain areas, and no doubt people can think of more, where it has gone backwards. Now, how do you deal with this, and what should socialists say about these kind of questions? Because you know, if we all start off from the fact that we're in favour of equality, the problem, it seems to me, is the question of how equality is posed in neoliberal society, and the way in which neoliberal capital kind of incorporates all sorts of aspects of equality without actually granting any genuine equality, and actually in many cases preventing genuine equality from taking place. You can take, for example, the institutionalization of the gender pay gap, which is quite astonishing, really. It's just reported every year, or we got a little bit closer, or we got a little bit further away. Nothing about the fact that women are systematically discriminated against throughout their lifetimes because they are women on the most fundamental economic basis. So there's that. And of course, if you look at where these radical and liberal ideas came from about oppression, about equality, they all came from the 1960s. I mean, the 1960s was a massive liberatory movement in all the developed capitalist countries. It was more than anywhere else in the United States. Absolutely fantastic development over the rights of black people, who at the beginning of this period were still not allowed to vote anywhere, were not allowed to sit on lunch counters or sit in the front of a bus in many, many areas of the South. By the end of the 1960s, of course, this had all been driven out by a mass movement. The women's movement was an absolutely huge movement in the United States, much, much more so than it ever was here. And the lesbian and gay movement, which is the way it was described for many years, of course, developed as a result of the Stonewall riots, really, which took place in New York in 1969. If you read the history, nothing at all to do with what is now called Stonewall, which is the kind of mainstream LGBT organization in this country. So if you look at those great movements, they were all tied to struggle. They were people, you know, people died to get black people the vote in the United States. The Black Panthers were systematically eradicated by the American state. They were shot in their beds, they were killed, they were imprisoned, all those kind of things. So it was very much tied to struggle. It was also tied to an appreciation of class and an understanding of class. Particularly if you look at the black movement, for example, goes from, we want to be able to sit at the front of the bus, it goes from that to, can we provide breakfast clubs for the poorest kids in Chicago or in Oakland? Can we link it with the workers' struggles, as Martin Luther King tried to do at the end of his life? So there's all these elements of class at a time when the working class movement internationally was on the rise. I mean, especially so in this country, which had one of the biggest levels of class struggle. And therefore, the women's liberation movement in this country was always connected to the unions and always connected to strikes and always connected to those kind of questions. And it was very much seen as part of a wider transformation of society. If you look at what has happened since then, those movements have atrophied, if you like. You know, what remains of black liberation or women's liberation or gay liberation from the 60s. Well, there's a lot of very, very good history. There's a lot of names like Stonewall. But actually, when you look at how it's transformed, then there's been very, very big changes. There's been a retreat from class for any idea that oppression is connected to class. That's one of the things. There's been much weakening of the unions in all the major wealthiest countries. And there's also been deindustrialization, which I think has played a very big role over the years in this idea that men are somehow losing out to women. You know, the manufacturing jobs go to be replaced by jobs that are very female dominated, you know, in retail or in office work or in any of those kind of things. So there's been all of that, but there's also been this big increase in what I would call kind of corporate equality, diversity and inclusion schemes. I mean, and this applies again, not just to sexism and racism. I was noticing as I came here this morning, there's a very big, as there are all over central London, very big building site where they've knocked down a load of perfectly useful buildings and they're going to build some great office block. And it's got on the big things surrounding it, which of course these things are massively environmentally damaging, it's got, there's a place where your dog can get a drink of water because this is helping the canine population, unlike, of course, the human population where all the drinking fountains have been taken away. But it's also got We Protect Trees. And, you know, this kind of thing, the corporate kind of incorporation of levels of pretty much cost-free equality issues, whether it's environmental or whether it's anything else, is very, very great. And of course, corporate EDI, I don't know if people here have been on any of these courses. To me, having been a socialist for a great many years, I find them insulting, to tell the truth. I mean, and you're never allowed to put an alternative view of where racism comes from the idea that it's white privilege and we all must feel terribly guilty about it. If you ever suggest that it might be to do with the capitalist class or the employers or anybody else, this is regarded as beyond the pale, and you obviously don't understand your inherent racism and all this kind of thing. So there's masses of these that go on, and they are part of, not everywhere, I mean, there's all sorts of employers that don't do these things, but in very large numbers they do. And I mean, for example, in universities, but in all the public sector and in a lot of the private sector as well that want to look progressive, banks and so on and so forth, they have these sorts of departments, they have this training, they have all these different kind of ways of looking at it. And of course, to many people, what does this look like? It looks like management speak, because that's what it is. It is management speak. They're telling you there's a certain acceptable level of equality, but let's not try and go any further. Let's not take the money from the dean of the university and give it to the lowest paid workers, mainly women, which would be absolutely shocking, of course. You're not allowed to do anything like that. But let's all talk about pronouns or talk about how guilty we all are and all this kind of thing. So there's those sorts of things going on. There's also the whole way in which politics of oppression have changed, and they've changed in the direction of identity politics, which is now the most dominant view, and the whole way that people now look at it. So if you're a black person, you can only have allies. You can't have white people fighting racism as well. All they can do is kind of help you along. You know, and it used to be, we had this slogan, black and white unite and fight, in the 1970s, which to me was actually a very, very good slogan and absolutely necessary. If you want to fight racism in Britain or in most other countries, you've got to get large sections of the white working class on your side. And you've got to make them realise that there has to be a commitment to anti-racism in order not to divide the working class on the basis of race or sex or gender or anything else that you want to talk about. So that's become changed. And the identity politics leads to individualism. What can you do to make life better? You know, what can you do not to be a racist, not to discriminate? Now, all these things are important. I mean, I don't think we should have the view that just because you subscribe to something in the abstract doesn't mean that you can just carry on behaving as you've always behaved and not think at all about how that might affect other people. But the idea that this has to be the centre of what you do, it seems to me, is completely wrong. And of course, if you're individuals, then it can't be about class. It can't be about the collective. It can't be about how we organise across these different barriers that have been created as a result of the system under which we live. And so there's a very interesting thing that happens, which is that if you look at the theory of intersectionality, which I'm sure many of you, particularly if you've had any contact with the academic world, it's absolutely kind of, it's, standing order number one of anything that you have to do. Now, I don't think, I think there's some very good points that have been made about intersectionality over the years, and I don't regard it as something just to be dismissed. But look at what it doesn't talk about. Class is one thing out of about 10, and what they mean by class is, did you have a terrible childhood living on a council estate? They don't see it about that class is a relationship, and the relationship of exploitation, which doesn't matter whether you have a mortgage or whether you live in a slum, you're part of the working class if those things are the case. It also, in my opinion, I've noticed this more and more, and it's kind of irritating me more and more, is the downplaying of women's oppression within the whole spectrum of oppressions. So 5 minutes, okay, so I need to, I'm doing quite well with my notes, so yeah. And the downplaying of women's oppression. Now, my explanation for both of these is that women are half the world, as people know, more or less. And the working class is a big majority of people, certainly in the industrialized countries. So to begin to treat them as oppressed in the way that you can talk about much smaller minorities creates huge economic, social and political problems for the people who want to do it, so they don't do it. So this is all left out. Now that then leads to two, it seems to me, if you downplay those questions, it leads to what? It leads to another problem that we have, which is the moralism of a lot of the left about these questions. And, I think we've got to deal with one issue. We've had it in the question of trans women in particular, but trans people in general. There's no debate. Trans women are women, trans men are men. Now, there is a debate. It's absolutely clear there's a debate. And when you say there's no debate, you're absenting yourself from being able to say anything or to push that debate in the kind of direction you might want to give it. In other words, away from the sort of bigots who say, well, can't you tell what a woman is and all this kind of thing, and towards an idea that we should support the right of trans people to live in the way that they want, but we also have to look at other questions, particularly to do with women's oppression in doing so. The same is true with racism. I mean, if you think about people who will be moving into struggle over the next few years, many of them will have racist ideas and all sorts of other backward ideas. To say no debate, you're a racist bigot, is just completely foolish and counterproductive. So I think we've got to move away from all of those things. Finally, in my last couple of minutes, I want to say this. Labourism is failing absolutely miserably in this country, as it is in a whole number of places. We've got the growth of the far right. We've got a very serious situation. We have to firstly fight against all forms of oppression. It seems to me that has to be our starting point, and that we have to defend people's right to live how they want to live, to have their own sexuality, to have their own lifestyles in the way that they want. But we also have to oppose the kind of tokenism that you get from the mainstream view of what oppression is, because this is one of the things that has weakened the fight against oppression, in my opinion, and I think will continue to do so. And that just means, finally, the class analysis of oppression, which essentially in one sentence says that it's the economic system of exploitation which allows and encourages the divisions. So women shouldn't earn as much as men, black people can only do manual working jobs, all these kind of things that different people subscribe to at different times. This is a result of the system of exploitation, and therefore we have to fight that as part of the fight against oppression. And we have to link these struggles. They're not separate struggles. The fight for better wages is linked to the fight against racism, is linked to the fight against women's oppression, is linked to all of these different issues, and we have to try and bring them together. So anyway, thanks very much.